Hello, and welcome to video 15. This one is on the demographic transition model. Also going to talk about China's one-child policy to start with. All right, so recently, within the last month, this policy has actually been removed and allowed to have two children, but it will not be updated in time for the exam. So it's best to go over it now as kind of a historical perspective. And so in the 1950s, 1953 exactly, China did their first census and kind of realized that they're going to have some issues with having too many people. Some issues such as fresh water and food are going to start to become scarce, and they kind of looked at this thing called population momentum, which we talked about with the age structure diagrams. If you looked at their age structure diagram at this point, it was shaped exactly like our developing world pyramid here. A really large number of individuals pre-reproductive, and they saw that momentum, those wide bars being carried up further and further and further in this, and it painted a picture of a lot of growth. And so between 1953 and 1973, the population increased by about 250 million people, which was a little under half of their current population. So really rapid growth during this time. And in between that time, from 1950s to 1970s, they encouraged, but it wasn't enforced, family planning. And so this became government perks and coercive measures, the one-child policy. And so they're actually going to incentivize having fewer children, and even go as far as coercive measures, right, forcing people to comply with the policy. And so some of the perks where the child would end up receiving free education and health care if there was only one child for the family. They would also get increased personal and family incomes, right? So China is the communist state, and so they would increase the incomes to the family and to the parents. They pushed back the marrying age, right? We talked about this. So if you marry later in life, there are fewer years for child birth, and so it delays that first birth, and so you have shorter time to continue to have more pregnancies. They made the contraceptives really available. Sterilizations were one of the only ways to have birth control in the rural areas, right outside the cities, and they weren't really that popular, right? The guys weren't signing up to get sterilized. So they actually introduced some new contraceptives, some safer ones, that would allow it to be a little bit more expensive, but not quite so permanent and life-changing. And then they also offered preferential housing and retirement income. Some of the other things they did here is if you worked for the government and you didn't comply with this, they would kind of curtail your promotions, right? So they kind of cut off where you were going up on the ladder and keep you from progressing any further. The policy was really enacted for the rural areas. The rural areas where you had the poor farmers without the life savings or the pension systems to keep them afloat needed to have kids, and especially they needed to have male children. In the Chinese culture at the time, when the female married, once she had grown up, she kind of left the family. And so if you were a farmer and you didn't have any male children, right, you had, so say you had 3 female children, once they grew up and got married, they weren't seen as part of your family anymore, so they would not be able to support you. And so these farmers, these poor rural farmers, needed to have male children so that when the male grew up, they would marry a female and kind of bring someone else into your family, and they would be there to support you. And so one of the biggest issues with the one-child policy is kind of the degradation of females in the society. Right, so female children were really frowned upon. A lot of times they would be aborted or given up for adoption or kind of even abandoned and just left there because they wouldn't be able to carry on the family name. And so the male child was seen as much more preferential, and you get kind of this inequality between children, and so even a shortage of females because they're being given up or abandoned at such a higher rate. On the other hand, it was really effective at curtailing the population growth in China. And so it's predicted that China's population is about 250 million less than what it could be. It's currently about 1.32 something billion people, and it's about estimated that it's 250 million less than what it should be if we didn't have the one-child policy. So this is a really well-known example of government population control, and it was really effective at the time. The demographic transition model, it's a progress or like a progression that countries follow as they kind of mature and grow up. And it's broken up into a couple different stages. It could be 4 stages. Some of them will also show 5 stages as well. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the end. But this is kind of the summary of what you're going to see. I want to show you a picture of the model here. It looks like this. And so you'll see down here on the x-axis, we've got time always increasing forward. And so we're going to start over here and move our way across as the country kind of grows up. And I'll look at each of these individual stages as we go. But some things to note here, this is total population, the kind of greenish line, and you can see it rise and then fall eventually. And the red one is birth rate, and again, it starts pretty high and it'll fall eventually. And the blue is death rate, starts pretty high and it'll fall eventually as well. So let's look at stage 1. Stage 1, so I just cut off that left part of the graph here. One thing I want to say right off the bat is practically no country today is in stage 1. There are some thoughts that some of these sub-Saharan African countries, the ones that are in constant war and struggle for power and conflict minerals, they could reverse back from a stage 2 into a stage 1 due to the demographic trap. And so that's one thought. But currently there's no country in this. This is kind of like our hunter-gatherers. You have a really high birth rate, but also a really high death rate in this stage. And that gives you a very low growth rate, right? We don't see much separation between the red birth rate line and the blue death rate line. They're kind of just all up and down, but there's no difference between them. And so this is most of human history. We kind of lived in this constant struggle between birth and death. And it gave a very low growth rate, but it's still going upwards, right? It's still positive growth. Stage 2, right? So now we add on the next stage here. And stage 2, something dramatic happens. We get a declining death rate. So birth rate remains unchanged in a stage 2 initially, but the death rate drops drastically. And so this gap, right? Let's look at how huge this gap is here. This gap between the 2 lines leads to population growth. And you can see at this time, right, we've got a very positive slope to our graph because the population is really starting to rocket up. And you can see just how much that total population increases from throughout stage 2. Why do we see this? A lot of different things. Right now we're starting to improve sanitation. We're getting medicine. This is kind of the industrial revolution that we saw in the United States and in much of Western Europe. So you're getting a lot more resources out of this time period. We're developing fossil fuels, right? We got a lot of cheap energy, which produces cheap food, and we're taking care of people better. That's why the death rate is falling. No more people getting sick, and a little simple cut may not result in death. So there's a lot less health issues at this time, and so the death rate drops. Currently, we see this as much of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Some countries in Asia, Afghanistan, Nepal, these are what we call the LDCs, the least developed countries, fall into stage 2. And you can find most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. Stage 3 is over here on the end. And so the important thing here in stage 3 is that we see a declining birth rate. And so now it starts kind of in stage 2 a little bit, but that birth rate drops even more significantly. And if you look at the population slope up here, our slope is still positive, but it's not nearly as steep. So we're getting a decreasing rate of population growth. And what's going on here is we have a change in behavior. We're focusing more on becoming cities. There's incentive to have fewer children, right? We've talked about these. You get more education, you're delaying pregnancies, more job opportunities. So some stage 3 country, really good example is Mexico today. A lot of South America is considered a stage 2, or a stage 3 country. And some other stage 3 countries, something like China, something like India, are looking a lot like stage 3 countries, where you still have high populations, still increasing at a pretty steep rate, but that birth rate's starting to fall. And eventually, as you can see here at the end, they're getting awfully close together. But this is characterized by a much lower growth rate. Stage 4. Stage 4 happens when the birth rate and the death rates meet. And so when they collide, you can see that total population starts to decrease. Our net trend is down. And in fact, the birth rate's even going to fall below the death rate. And so this is like the United States today. I put a little note here for stage 5. This is kind of a proposed one. It's not universally accepted, but it's characterized by really low birth rates and rising death rates. Right? This would be due to old age. And we see also declining growth rates there because the birth rates are lower and so negative. And so this is several countries like Europe, Greece is one, Japan would be another example of a potential stage 5 demographic transition model country. And so let's look at some of these population pyramids and how they relate to the demographic transition stage. And we're focusing on the shape. So be careful to pay close attention to what the shape of the demographic transition model looks like. It'll tell you what stage it falls in. So Mali is our first one. Mali is one of those LDCs. And so you can see we get this very typical pyramid shape, very smooth transition down with a very wide base. That's a stage 2. Stage 3, India, and so we're still going to have a wide base, but now that middle is wider. You can see it's starting to round off at the end a little bit here. That's a sign of a declining growth rate. Those birth rates and death rates are coming in closer together. United States, classic stage 4, you can see a significant difference. We definitely have a wide base here, and that bottom is pulling in some, so it's a little bit more slender than what we saw in stage 3, and that's because those birth rates and death rates are about even right now, and so we're not exceeding and going up any further. The last one is the narrow base, and so this is showing negative growth here. You see it's pinched in at the bottom. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is this predicted and actual age diagram. So the country's name is pulled off here, and I want you to just take a second and think about this. The blue lines are the predicted population, and they predicted this in the 1960s for the 1990s. And this is what the pyramid was thought to look like, or should look like, by the time the 90s hit. The red is what it actually looked like. And so the question is here, what could make this difference? And so take a second and think about it. What could be the difference here? It's AIDS, HIV and AIDS, and how that affects on the population, or how that affects the population. It's referred to as the population chimney. And so what goes on is you get a really high mortality from AIDS in young adulthood, right? So these would be our early reproductive stage individuals, and you see a lot of them die out. And so because of this, you get a really narrow chimney-like shape, right? A really narrow column in the pyramid. The base also shrinks in a little bit too, right? If I flip back to it a second here, you see the base also shrinks into here a little bit. Those would be our higher infant mortality rate due to AIDS being passed on from mothers to children. But these age groups, right, the 10 to 15 to 25, this age group here in the early 90s, all would have been really highly susceptible to AIDS. And so as that group progresses in years, you see that show up in these really narrow bars going up through the top. And so you really get a shrunken top part of the pyramid. That leads to a lot of gaps in skilled workers, right? These people here are the ones that should be in college and becoming chemical engineers and managers of businesses, and really the smart thinkers of the country, people that are going to push it forward and out of stage 2 and into stage 3. And with them dying off, you really end up with a shortage of really skilled people to kind of lead the country forward. Demographic trap is the last part I'm going to talk about for it. This is a proposed path of our least developed countries. And so they're trapped in stage 2. And so it's kind of this endless cycle, right? Positive feedback loop that keeps them in there. In the 1970s, we kind of thought they were going to make it out due to economic growth, or their economy was going to grow so much they would push them into stage 3. But what's happened is the population is so high that growth can't keep up with it, right? So there is still some growth, but the population's growing higher, and so that growth is spread thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's kind of running out to the point where they're stuck in stage 2. And so you get this downward spiral in standard of living, right? Lack of clean water, lack of safe shelter, poor nutrition. A lot of issues come from being stuck in stage 2. Things like disease can also push them back into the demographic trap, and also those kind of over-controlling warlords and constant wars going on in these countries can push them into stage 2 and even back towards stage 1. That's all I have for you today for video 15. I hope you enjoyed it. Please bring some sort of evidence and some notes to class tomorrow, and we'll discuss. Thanks for watching.